Thank you, Sam. Wow, I must really be something. I am an amateur historian who's been given the privilege to present some of my research here at this august facility, so I greatly appreciate that. I thank you for coming to this is another installment of my history series, Lucas and Garrison, 1875, and I'll explain what that's about in a minute. Today we're going to be looking at two immigrants who came to St. Louis in the early 1800s and have had a huge impact on our community, both then and now. First, allow me to once again give a short explanation of what Lucas and Garrison 1875 is all about. In 2015, my wife and I visited an exhibit here at the History Museum, which has had a major impact on my thinking about St. Louis. The exhibit featured the work of Camille Dry and Richard Compton and their Herculean efforts to create a map which included every building in St. Louis in 1875. Every building. The map they successfully completed encompassed 70 square miles. Think about that, 70 square miles. The work was called Pictorial St. Louis, the Great Metropolis of the Mississippi Valley, a topographical survey drawn in perspective, 1875. It was published as a book composed of 110 13 by 9-inch map plates, which when combined showed the entire St. Louis area. In 2015, I was working on a history project for Central Presbyterian Church, which was started in 1844 in downtown St. Louis. At that time, I wondered where the church was located in 1875 on the Compton and Dry maps. Here's how the 110 map plates look when they're arranged together. The church appeared on plate 71 on the northeast corner of Lucas and Garrison Avenues. And as you can see, in 1875, the neighborhood depicted on plate 71 was a densely populated region of St. Louis. The neighborhood that plate 71 encompassed was located east of what is now St. Louis University and north of Harris Stowe University, which we now consider Midtown. Each Compton and Dry map included a list of residents and businesses and institutions located on that map. And plate 71 included 104 residents and churches. My historic interest is to rediscover the people living in this one neighborhood in 1875 and to bring their stories to life again. Look at plate 71 again and the density of the buildings in that neighborhood. Remarkably, except for a few remaining foundations and outbuildings, no structures still exist today from 1875, 150 years later. I also did not recognize a single name on the 104 listed on plate 71. So this research, Lucas and Garrison, is not dissimilar to an archaeological dig in search of a lost civilization. Who were these people? That leads us to our focus today regarding two immigrants, two St. Louis gentlemen and their garden. I'm going to be doing a lot of jumping back and forth today, so stay on your toes or you'll be lost in the weeds. Or in today's presentation's case, the prairie grasses. Gentleman number one, Dr. George Engelman. He is the connection to the Lucas and Garrison Research Project in 1875. Dr. Engelman lived on plate 71, just south of the intersection of Lucas and Garrison. His story and contribution to St. Louis history is monumental, and yet few have ever heard his name. George Engelman was born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1809. He was the oldest of 13 children, 9 of whom reached maturity. His father, Julius Bernhard Engelman, and several of that family's earlier generations were ministers in the Reformed Church at Bacharach on the Rhine. And Julius was educated for the ministry, but he decided to devote his life to education. George Engelman's father established a school for young women in Frankfurt, which was a rarity at the time. His wife, Julie Antoinette was Julius Engelman's coadjutor in the school for young women, and its success was largely due to her management and tact. Dr. Engelman lived at 3033 Locust Street in 1875 on the corner of Locust and Garrison. Here's a picture of his home in 1875. I'm continually astounded as I do this research about the important men and women who lived in this neighborhood during this era. This photograph is of the front of Dr. Engelman's home on Locust looking north. The house in the background is the house of Robert Barnes, who founded Barnes Hospital. Including Dr. Engelman, our subject for today, 10 residents are listed on plate 71 as living on Garrison in 1875. Each has a remarkable story worth remembering and telling. These 10 luminaries lived within 4 blocks of each other on the now lost neighborhood of plate 71. Each of their stories need to be told, but those are for another day. George Engelman received his early education at the gymnasium at Frankfurt, Germany. A gymnasium in the German education system is the most advanced and highest of the 3 types of German secondary schools. He remarked that he first became interested in plants, and that's important. He first became interested in plants around the age of 15. Also at that age, his disposition to study was such that he voluntarily devoted much of his time after the performance of his stated school duties to the study of history, modern languages, and drawing. He was scholarly. Is anyone scholarly anymore? His education was assisted by a scholarship funded by the Reformed Congregation of Frankfurt. In 1827, he began his studies at the University of Heidelberg. There he met renowned botanists Carl Schimper and Alexander Braun. He developed an intimate friendship and correspondence with Braun that continued unbroken until his death. He also retained a friendship with Schimper. Sadly, Schimper was a penetrating but erratic genius, and after obtaining a remarkable grasp of philosophical botany, he turned his back on the subject entirely. In 1828, young Engelman's studies at Heidelberg were interrupted when he joined other students in a political demonstration. In less gentle words, he was kicked out. He thereupon left Heidelberg and entered the University of Berlin, where he stayed for 2 years. In 1831, he received the degree of MD from the University of Würzburg. His dissertation for his medical degree related more to botany than to medicine. This was the foreshadowing of his future contributions to that discipline. His dissertation was published in Frankfurt in 1832 under the title of De Anathosia Predomus. He was devoted to morphology, and that's the study of the structure of monstrosities or aberrant forms of plants, and it was illustrated by 5 plates and figures drawn and transferred to lithographic stones by the author's own hand. He was a very talented man. Wishing to visit America, George Engelman accepted a proposition from his uncles to become their purchase agent for lands in the United States. In September 1832, he left Frankfurt and sailed from Bremen, Germany, to Baltimore, Maryland. In addition to his duties addressing land investment opportunities, he also spent time on botanical travels, first visiting Thomas Nuttall, a noted English botanist who had emigrated to Philadelphia to further his studies. Engelman then went to St. Louis and from there visited several adjacent states. To better consider the lands of the new country to which he had come, Engelman made long, lonesome, and often adventurous horseback journeys in Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas. He often suffered sickness and hardship upon those journeys, but he persevered until he finished all of the business he had planned to do. He made much use of his scientific as well as his practical knowledge in the accomplishment of that business, doing mineralogical and geological work, but only the botanical notes which he made were used in subsequent scientific career. He settled with relatives and the lawyer Gustav Kerner on a farm in St. Clair County, Illinois, near Belleville for 3 years. Completing his business arrangement with his uncles, in the autumn of 1835, Engelman moved to St. Louis and established a medical practice. Gentleman number 2, Henry Shaw. Henry Shaw was born on July 24th, 1800, in Sheffield, England, the center of iron and steel manufacturing. Henry's father, Joseph Shaw, moved to Sheffield as a young man to open his own iron factory, along with a partner. The firm manufactured iron grates, fire irons, and so forth. Henry was the oldest of 4 children. He had 2 sisters, Sarah and Caroline, and a brother who died in infancy. Shaw received his primary school education in the village of Thone near his home in Sheffield. When he was about 10 or 11, he was transferred to the prestigious Mill Hill School near London. He studied at this boarding school for about 6 years before returning home to Sheffield in 1816 or 1817. While he had been away at school, Shaw's father's business had come upon hard times. The family could no longer afford to send Henry to the expensive school that other children of the upper classes attended. But during his time at Mill Hill School, Shaw gained the basic education of an English gentleman. He had studied the classics, learned some Latin and Greek, and studied French. He also studied mathematics and was introduced to the sciences. More importantly, he acquired the attitudes and the outlook of the English gentry. You know, the English gentry like Downton Abbey. That training, confidence, and polish would continue throughout his life in the United States. On his return to Sheffield, Shaw began to assist his father with the business. Searching for new markets, the elder Shaw turned his sights on the vast potential of the Americas. Iron and steel manufacturing in the former colonies was not as advanced as in England, and Sheffield steel products were some of the finest in the world. In 1818, Henry accompanied his father on his first trip across the Atlantic Ocean, where the pair did business in Quebec, Canada. Young Henry made such an impression on his father with his business acumen. The next year, he was sent to New Orleans alone on business, and he was just 19. Vast territories of the American Midwest had been opened up the previous decade by the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the United States. A shipment of goods to New Orleans had been lost or misplaced, and Shaw was sent to find the shipment. Although he recovered the goods, he could not find a buyer in New Orleans. With a business savvy and entrepreneurial spirit that was to mark his adult life, Shaw was determined to find a market for the goods in the interior of the country. In 1817, New Orleans had become the portal in this area by steam-powered paddle wheel riverboats that made their way up the Mississippi from the port of New Orleans. In the spring of 1819, Henry Shaw purchased passage for himself and his goods on a steamship called the Maid of Orleans. The trip to St. Louis took 40 days, cost Shaw $120. The words on this handwritten sketch say, "Steamboat Maid of New Orleans, on the Mississippi River going to St. Louis." On May 4th, 1819, Shaw landed in the then small village on the Mississippi that was to become his home and the beneficiary of his philanthropy. At that time, the village was about 50 years old. The city encompassed about 3 blocks west from the river. Shaw set up his hardware store, selling high-quality cutlery and other metal products. His first storefront was at number 4 Main Street, between Market and Chestnut. The goods he sold were procured by Shaw's uncle, James Hoole, back home in Sheffield, and shipped to St. Louis through New Orleans and sold at a tidy profit. Hoole also provided the initial capital for the business. It turned out to be a great investment. It was a good time to be in the hardware business in St. Louis. During the 2 decades he stayed in this business, roughly from 1819 to 1839, St. Louis grew very rapidly. Shaw sold his goods to the people of St. Louis, to soldiers and farmers, and to other new immigrants to the area. He also found a ready market in those making their way to the lands in the West. Many of the pioneers moving westward were outfitted in St. Louis, and Shaw had the kind of hardware, tools, and cutlery that they would need for the long trip to set up a new homestead. Shaw never married, and he did not live extravagantly. And the income from his business, therefore, soon provided him with the beginning of his great wealth. He invested the income from his hardware business shrewdly, buying a great deal of real estate in the St. Louis area. Shaw bought many commercial properties and vacant lots in the city. He also bought large tracts of land in the outlying areas during those years. And back then, the outlying areas were about where Busch Stadium is today. Their garden. This is an early rendering of what St. Louis probably looked like in the early 1800s. Beyond the 3 blocks along the river that were developed, there was nothing but prairie grasses and groves of trees as far as the eyes could see. Some properties that Shaw initially bought in St. Louis quickly changed from investment for financial gain to investment for what he chose as his life's work, the development of his garden. The prairies covered much of St. Louis City and County when the French settlers arrived, and they persisted well into the 19th century. The St. Louis prairies took different forms: dry upland grassland, wet upland meadows, grassland with scattering trees, grassland with brush, grassy parks and groves of trees, and bottom prairies along the Mississippi and other streams. These prairies function integrally in the life of the French villagers and early Anglo-Americans. They were sites of the first cultivated fields, and they served as natural grass pastures and hayfields, the source of fire and fence wood, and the place to hunt game and collect strawberries and other fruits. This drawing shows the location of the underdeveloped lands outside the small town of St. Louis. The area we now know as the state of Missouri wasn't part of the United States until the Louisiana Purchase in 1804. French and other settlers who moved into the area in the 1700s received land grants from the colonial governments at the time, whether Spanish or French. The circled area was the target of many of Shaw's purchases. This 1853 map records the purchases of the properties that were in the prairies. In 1853, most of the property had been purchased, but none of these properties were developed. A land survey was part of the process of obtaining a legal title. Surveys done prior to 1804 used units of measures called arpents instead of acres. After the Louisiana Purchase, residents wanted to know if their claims to land would remain valid. The U.S. government set up a board of land commissioners, but it took them more than 50 years to review the claims, by which time most of the original claimants were dead. The red box shows the part of the prairies that we're interested in today. In this blow-up, I realize you probably can't see, but trust me, you can see who the purchasers were of these strips. The strips, or arpents, the French definition of property parameter, was 190 feet long, and the width was the variable determining the property size. One block that Henry Shaw acquired consisted of a tract in an area known as Prairie de Noyer, which translates in French to the meadow of walnuts. In his later life, Shaw wrote the following account of the first time he saw this land in 1820, soon after he arrived in St. Louis, and I quote, "For a distance of nearly 2 miles from where Tower Grove Park is now laid out to Taylorwick Station, no trees were growing, except 2 or 3 venerable cottonwoods in the low ground on the watercourse running from Rock Spring. On this watercourse were a few plants of the sweet-scented water lily and a clump of hazel bushes on the rising ground, where the grove at the garden now exists. The prairie was grown over with tall natural prairie grass with an occasional patch of wild strawberry, which neither a tuft of grass or plant of strawberry can now be found. So you can see he already had an incredible love of botanical things. So how did Henry Shaw take ownership of these properties in the Prairie de Neuilly? Orchestrated serendipity. And here's one example. Benjamin Franklin Howard, a member of the U.S. Congress from Lexington, Kentucky, was appointed governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory in 1812. Howard divided this section of the territory into 5 counties: St. Charles, St. Louis, St. Genevieve, Cape Girardeau, and New Madrid. Howard, a lifelong bachelor, died in 1814 and left his estate, located in southwest St. Louis, to his nephew, Benjamin Howard Payne. Payne, also a lifelong bachelor, died in 1821 and left his property to his younger brother, Thomas Jefferson Payne, who moved to St. Louis in 1828 after he gained title to the estate. Henry Shaw was also buying property in the southwest St. Louis area at this time. The first time he saw Prairie de Neuilly, he wanted it. Shaw was very happy to loan money to Thomas Payne, who used his 760 acres of land as collateral. Well, Payne could not repay the loan, so Shaw foreclosed. This providentially is where the Missouri Botanical Garden and Tower Grove Park are located today. In this extreme blow-up of a later edition of this 1853 map, you can see Henry Shaw's Tower Grove house, the museum, and the gardens to the south, even the grove where he was buried. And I'll tell you that north is to the right on this map so that you can get perspective. This is a street map that shows St. Louis, what it looked like in 1857. You'll notice that the western edge of St. Louis was a block west of Grand Avenue. The city fathers were smart enough to make sure both sides of main thoroughfares were part of St. Louis's boundaries so they could collect taxes from the businesses on both sides of the street. Today, the current boundary of St. Louis is not Skinker Boulevard. It's 1 block west of Skinker Boulevard. You'll also notice that there was no development depicted at this time west of Grand except for one single solitary house, Henry Shaw's house. In 1849, Shaw hired George I. Barnett, a prominent St. Louis architect, to design his country home, a 2-story Italian-style villa. At the time of construction, the house stood upon a tall grass prairie highlighted by a grove of sassafras trees. As visitors viewed the home's tower next to the grove, it became known as the Tower Grove House. And here is my photographic rendering of the Tower Grove house today. Shaw's tall 3-story city townhouse was built in 1850 at the southwest corner of 7th and Locust in downtown St. Louis. Architect George Barnett again designed this building, but in the Victorian Renaissance Revival style. Shaw built this big house, hoping to convince his mother and sister to move to St. Louis, but that never happened. Here is Compton and Dry's plate 21 that shows the location of Shaw's townhouse, which is circled, and the old courthouse for reference. Allow me to rant again about this map project, the Compton and Dry map project. This is just one of the Compton and Dry 110 maps that were created in 1875. I also have to remind myself continually, these 2 magnificent George Barnett buildings and so many other beautiful buildings of the era were built 30 years before the dawn of electricity. In 1889, at the time of his death, as per Shaw's will, the building was moved to the Missouri Botanical Garden, brick by brick. A large addition was added soon thereafter, and the building is now used as the administration offices and the library, and was designated as a city landmark in 1971. Another notable design by George Barnett is the Missouri Governor Mansion in Jefferson City, which was built in 1871. And in 1875, Barnett lived in St. Louis on Chestnut, just 2 blocks south of Plate 71. So back to gentleman number 1, Dr. George Engelman. During the 3 years that had passed since he left his native land for America, the meager means he brought with him were exhausted. He began the practice of his profession in absolute poverty. To furnish his office, he even was obliged to sell his gun and the faithful horse which had carried him on so many long and lonesome journeys. At that time, St. Louis was little more than a frontier trading post, but Engelman had strong faith in its future greatness, and he lived to see it to become one of the chief cities in the United States. In 1836, he founded a German newspaper in St. Louis called Das Westland, which contained valuable articles on both life and manners in the United States, and gained a high reputation both in the United States and Europe. And it's said that contributed to many immigrants coming from Germany as they read that newspaper. 4 years passed before he had laid the foundation of his medical practice. In 1840, he returned to Germany, where in Kreuznach he married his cousin, Dorothea Horstmann, on June 11th. Upon his return to America and New York City, Engelman for the first time met Asa Gray, already the most noted American botanist, and the friendship between those two eminent men was broken only by death. This friendship is also noteworthy because of its beneficial effect on the botanical science in America. Upon his return to St. Louis with his young wife, Engelman immediately resumed his medical practice. Then and long afterward, a large proportion of the inhabitants of St. Louis were of French or German-speaking families, and his familiarity with both of those languages as well as English gave him a great advantage in extending his practice. Because of this, and of his great professional ability, as the years went on, he acquired a financial competence that gave him independence. Never, however, did he take advantage of his success. Whenever his medical labors were relaxed, his scientific work held his full attention. In his later years, Engelman focused on botany. He took several vacations and devoted them all to the gathering of data for his scientific work. One of these vacations extended from 1856 to 1858, the greater part of the first summer having been spent in the botanical work at Harvard Gardens and the herbarium in the companionship with Asa Gray. Then with his wife and young son, he visited his native land and other parts of Europe, occupying his time with scientific observation and study. In 1868, Dr. Engelman and his wife visited Europe for a year as their son was in Berlin pursuing his medical studies. These visits to Europe were also the occasions of frequent interviews with men whose names were well known in the scientific world, such as Joseph Dalton Hooker, Alexander Braun, Heinrich Anton de Bary, Rudolf Virchow, and others. In 1879, Engelman published Cactusea of the Boundary, which studied cactus on the border of the United States and Mexico. He also made special studies in pines, rushes, spurges, and other little-known difficult groups, contributing numerous articles on them to St. Louis Academy of Sciences and to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and to Government Works. He was one of the first to study the North American vines, and nearly all of that is known scientifically of the American species is due to his investigations. His first monograph, The Grapevines of Missouri, was published in 1860. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, who cares? How does this guy's 150-year-old botanical study affect me? Well, I'm going to tell you. Engelman played an important but little-known role in rescuing the French wine industry. In the 1870s, French vineyards came under attack by an aphid-like pest which sucks the sap out of the roots of the grapevines and French growers observed that certain imported American vines resisted that pest. And the French government dispatched a scientist to St. Louis to consult with the Missouri State entomologist and with Engelmann, who had studied American grapes since 1850. Engelmann arranged to have millions of grapevine cuttings and seeds collected and sent to France, where the species proved to be very successful in providing healthy, persistent rootstock. So, the next time you're enjoying a glass of French wine, you can thank Dr. Engelmann. The confluence. By the age of 40, Shaw was one of the largest landholders in the city of St. Louis and had accumulated enough wealth to retire. This gave him the freedom to travel and pursue his great interest in botany. Henry Shaw was determined to have one of the finest botanical gardens in the world right here in St. Louis. He traveled extensively for 10 years after he retired to see the great gardens of Europe. His entrepreneurial leanings led him to consult Dr. William Jackson Hooker, the director of the world's premier botanical garden. The Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew, not far from London. Shaw wrote to Hooker explaining his plans to build a garden in St. Louis, seeking the eminent botanist's advice. On a visit to England in 1857, he had personally consulted Hooker on the establishment of his garden. Hooker suggested that Shaw contact fellow St. Louisan Dr. Engelmann, the gynecologist who was also a well-respected amateur botanist. In 1856, Engelmann had been one of the founders of the St. Louis Academy of Science. Engelmann had many contacts among American scientists, and it was he in turn who put Shaw in contact with Harvard's Asa Gray, then America's leading naturalist. Engelmann encouraged the wealthy Shaw to develop his gardens to be of scientific as well as benefit to the public's pleasure. Why were all of these famed botanists willing to support Shaw in his work? Well, they knew he was very rich and had the capacity and drive to make a big difference in botany. So with the advice of Hooker, Engelmann, and Gray, Shaw set his mind on building a first-class botanical garden. Gentleman number 3. You say, a third gentleman. What's that all about? John Hawkins Doswell was born in London, England in 1827. He was educated in Southampton and learned his profession and developed his great artistic skill at the Royal Botanical Garden at Kew under the tutelage of the very same William Jackson Hooker that was instrumental in inspiring and directing Henry Shaw to seek advice and counsel from Dr. Engelmann. John Doswell immigrated to Cincinnati in 1852 to begin his impressive career in America. John Dawkins Doswell became the superintendent and landscape architect at the famed 103-acre Lindenwood Cemetery in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in 1859. He remained at that position until 1900 at the time of his death. Lindenwood also owes much to Doswell and later his son for its original landscaping, the building of rustic bridges, gardens, historic stone houses, and caves. Today it is still a renowned example of classic landscape architecture. So what does John Doswell have to do with today's historical storyline? Absolutely nothing, except for the fact that he's my great-great-grandfather. Back to Shaw's garden. This 1870 map shows the land tracts of owners of properties in the Prairie de Noyer. You can see at the very top is the developed Shaw's garden in that red rectangle. Here's a blow-up of that area in 1870. Several of these tracts east of Tower Grove Avenue were also owned by Henry Shaw, except for one property. He really wanted an impressive entrance to his garden coming west from Grand Avenue. So how did Shaw secure that property? Stay with me on this because it's a little complicated. In the early 1800s, Major William Christie purchased a sizable section of land from Charles Gratiot. Subsequently, Christie sold 235 acres to Captain William Chambers in 1816 for $763.75. That's $3.25 per acre. The land is bordered by what is now Grand Avenue, Tower Grove, Magnolia, and Shaw. Chambers left the land to his daughter, Mary Lawrence Tyler. It was called the Tyler Tract. Shaw wanted his entry boulevard to run right through the middle of the Tyler Tract. After some negotiations, Mary Tyler sold the right-of-way to Shaw, as it is shown in this 1870 map, with some conditions. The map is actually incorrect and lists the tract as the Mary L. Taylor land rather than the correct Mary L. Tyler. You can see this narrow strip through the Tyler tract, and now he had his grand entrance, and it's now Flora Place. As an addendum, Mary Louise Tyler subsequently sold the balance of the land that her father purchased. Remember, he bought it in 1818 for $763.75. She sold it in 1888 for $700,000. You can see how fortunes were made on real estate back then. Her daughter, Anne Eliza, was married to Captain Silas Bent, who lived at 1717 Garrison in 1875 and was a neighbor of George Engelman. And that's another story for another day. Now we're up to 1875 and the Compton and Dry depictions of Shaw's Garden and Tower Grove Park. This is a colorized rendering of plate 91 of the Compton and Dry maps. Shaw's Garden is included in detail with its 1875 parameters. A portion of the less developed Tower Grove Park is shown in the lower left corner. And here's a blow-up of some of the identifiable buildings in 1875, and they're still there today. The Tower Grove House, the museum, the two mausoleums, and allow me again to be awestruck again about these maps. This is a small section of one of the 110 maps, and look at the detail. In 1875, even though St. Louis was 111 years old, there were only 3 developed properties west of Grand Avenue: Tower Grove Park, Shaw's Garden, and the 3400 Russell Avenue property of Charles Stockstrom, the founder of the Quick Metal Stove Company, which later became the Magic Chef Company. He built his mansion across from Reservoir Park on Kings Highway. Again, another great story for another day. Back to gentleman number 2. In his later years, Shaw donated the additional land adjoining the garden to the city of St. Louis for Tower Grove Park. He helped with its construction, including the pavilion and various works of art. He also donated the properties on either side of Tower Grove Park to the city, hoping that people would lease the land and build mansions surrounding the park. The plan was for the lease proceeds to be used to maintain the park. That idea failed. No one was willing to build mansions on leased land. Shaw gave the city of St. Louis a school and the land for a hospital. He endowed the Washington University School of Botany and helped found this Missouri Historical Society. Shaw's interesting life included many intriguing stories. This is a piano. How many of you knew that? You can tell it's Henry Shaw's piano because the photograph above it shows his city home. Now for a little fun with grammar. During Shaw's life, this piano was not just a noun, it was the object of a proposition. Henry Shaw was sued for breach of promise by Effie Castang, a lady who said he had promised to marry her. The pejorative evidence in the case was this piano. Castang said Shaw had given her the piano as a sign of his intent to marry her. Shaw said he had simply loaned her the piano and later reclaimed it. The Missouri Democrat, a popular newspaper, described Karstang as a woman of about 30, tall and graceful, with dark hair and brilliant eyes, blonde complexion, and a mouth expressive of great firmness and decision of character. A jury rewarded Karstang $100,000 in the breach of promise case, but the verdict was later overturned. And that very restored piano resides today in the Tower Grove House, if you're ever visiting. Shaw was a slave owner, as were many wealthy people during that era, but he was also known in St. Louis as a generous man and a kind employer. One of the reasons his mother would not move to St. Louis from New York was that she abhorred the concept of slavery. Another reason was St. Louis weather. Henry Shaw, with the help of his advisors, made the Missouri Botanical Garden a first-rate scientific institution. In a letter dated August 10, 1857, 167 years ago, Sir William Jackson Hooker, the director of the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew, advised Shaw of the importance of having a library and museum attached to the garden. Shaw quickly took the advice to heart. He empowered his friend, Dr. Engelmann, to purchase for him in Europe many books that would become the heart of the garden's research collections. Engelmann was also able to purchase the herbarium of the recently deceased German botanist Johann Jacob Bernhardi. He bought the impressive 60,000 specimen herbarium for $600. Can you imagine? Bernhardi spent his life collecting the 60,000 specimens, and his kids sold it for a penny apiece. A herbarium is a collection of various species of plants collected and dried for reference. Here is an example of one specimen. These specimens are not drawings, but the actual plants dried, pressed, and laboriously preserved. When Henry Shaw needed a building to house his library and herbarium, he again commissioned architect George I. Barnhart to design it. Shaw asked Barnhart to base the design on the Museum of the Economic Botany at Kew Gardens. The red brick building that Barnett designed also housed Shaw's Museum of Natural History, and it came to be called the Museum Building. And inside the ceiling was painted with murals of natural science and the names of famous scientists. The Tower Grove House, the administration building, and the museum building were made up the original campus of the early garden. Over the years, the building has served many additional purposes. For a time, it was a public restaurant, and later it housed the Ewan collection of books and papers on the subject of botany and history of the science. You may well know the museum has recently been lovingly restored with tributes to Dr. Engelmann, Asa Gray, and William Hooker. It was built in 1859 for $25,000, and after 90 years of underuse, restored for $8 million. It is worth a visit, and it really is like walking through the past. Back to gentleman number one. While botanical investigations constituted much of the greater part of Dr. Engelmann's later scientific work, he also had an interest in other investigations as well. For example, he began meteorological observations when he first settled in St. Louis and continued them without intermission until his death. The death of his wife on January 29, 1879, greatly affected him. He turned to plants, seeking relief and study, but life and the continuance of his labors seemed almost hopeless. His condition changed little during the remainder of that winter. In the spring, C.S. Sargent came to him with a proposition. Charles Sprague Sargent was the American botanist. He was appointed in 1872 as the first director of Harvard University's Arnold Arboretum in Boston, and held that post until his death. Sargent wanted Engelmann to join him on a journey through the forest of the Pacific Coast region. He accepted the invitation, and that journey was undoubtedly difficult for a man of his age. At that time, he was 70. The adventure was of great benefit to him physically, It also caused Engelmann's shattered spirit to be revived. He resumed and sustained his lifelong habit of cheerfulness of manner. This is truly a great photograph from Engelmann's later life and his travels in the West. It depicts Engelmann on the right, C.S. Sargent on the left, and their guide, Skinner. This was a true Wild West adventure in their three-piece wool suits. They were explorers, but they weren't killing bears or buffaloes or Indians. They were collecting pine cones for their botanical studies. During Engelmann's life, he was commemorated with the names of several plants, including the Engelmann oak, the Engelmann spruce, and Engelmann's prickly pear. Some of Engelmann's greatest contributions were in the study of cactus in the Southwest. Engelmann's botanical collection is valuable in that it contains original specimens from which many Western plants have been named and described. His entire collection was given to the Missouri Botanical Garden. This gift led to the founding of the Henry Shaw School of Botany as a department of Washington University, where Engelmann was the Engelmann Professorship of Botany was established by Shaw in his honor. How much did George Engelmann mean to America? St. Louis and the Missouri Botanical Garden. This bust of Engelmann is located southwest of the herbarium at the garden. Henry Shaw had been fortunate in invoking the interest of Sir William Hooker. He was lucky also in gaining the support of Asa Gray, America's finest botanist. But most importantly was his friendship and collaboration with George Engelmann, the greatest botanist of the West by avocation, who, as his neighbor in St. Louis, was always close at hand and ready to help. In his recollections years later, Shaw would gratefully recall the contributions and advice of Engelmann. Dr. Engelmann died February 4th, 1884, 2 days after his 75th birthday. Many of his publications were so scattered at his death that they were not easily available to those who needed them. Henry Shaw decided to find all of Engelmann's botanical works and combine them into one publication as a memorial to his old friend and associate. The Botanical Works of the late George Engelmann, collected by Henry Shaw, Esquire, was published in 1887. So we're back to where Dr. Engelmann's home was on Compton and Dry's Plate 71. He lived there until his death in 1884. Edgar Anderson, a 20th century director of Shaw's Garden and the holder of the George Engelmann Professorship at Washington University, said this of his physician botanist: "There is a possibility without Engelmann there would have been no Missouri Botanical Garden. And almost certainly it would have never become the outstanding scientific effort it is today, but for him. Dr. Engelmann's legacy is clear. He's a St. Louisan who should not be forgotten." Henry Shaw, died in 1889 at the age of 89. This photograph shows him in 1885. He is widely remembered for his generosity and philanthropy. Over 130 years after his death, many who visit Missouri Botanical Garden today still refer to it as Shaw's Garden. Shaw designated an oval-shaped grove of trees near his home to be his final resting place. He constructed a mausoleum there in which he would be laid to rest. Actually, he built 2 mausoleums, both designed by George Burnett. This, the first, was an octagonal limestone structure with a copper roof. Shaw decided he did not like the model because the runoff from the copper tended to turn the stones green. So he moved that first structure to this present location north of the grove, and it's used to house the sculpture of Carlo Nicoli, a reproduction of an ancient Roman statue. It's called Victory and symbolizes the victory of science over ignorance. A second mausoleum was constructed of red Missouri granite and serves as his final resting place today. Shaw's legacy was very important to him. This is not a photograph of Henry Shaw when he died. This is a photograph of Shaw posing for his mausoleum tomb sculpture in 1885. You can see the sculpture through the stained glass and leaded windows of the mausoleum today. And by the way, Shaw probably would have been very irritated that the actual statue looks little like his posed photograph. He's probably turning over in his grave, or in this case, his mausoleum. Shaw's body lay in state at his beloved museum building in 1889. Thousands of mourners queued up to pay their final respect to one of St. Louis's wealthiest and most philanthropic citizens. At the time of his death, news reports speculate that his worth was $2.5 million, and that would be the equivalent of hundreds of millions today. You cannot begrudge entrepreneurs making all the money they can make when they so unselfishly give it back to the city they love. St. Louis owes an eternal debt to Engelman and Shaw. And the next time you're strolling through the beautiful Missouri Botanical Garden, I hope you appreciate more deeply these two St. Louis gentlemen and their gardens. We all have a peripheral knowledge of Henry Shaw's life, but the life of Dr. George Engelman and his contributions to St. Louis have been much less known. His is one of the historical St. Louis storylines that have been lost to time. And for me, this is what historical research and documentation is all about, making sure that doesn't happen. And I thank you for your time today.